David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I'm back from my trip. It's really me. I'm here, and I'll talk about my trip on the bonus show, but sort of a bummer to have to start my first show back with something so disgusting and despicable, but this is the reality of what's going on. If you want to get a sense, really an actual real sense of where the Trump administration is going militarily, you have only to look at Mike Pence's speech over the weekend to West Point graduates. I'm going to show you a clip today, which cuts really to the heart of neoconservative American right-wing military aggression. This is the worst of the United States. This is a prime example of why so many around the world are disgusted with us. Listen closely to this one because it's not getting the attention that it deserves. This is from a speech that Mike Pence gave over the weekend at West Point, which is a military academy. It's one of 5 U.S. service academies, which are undergraduate schools for commissioned officers in the military. In the case of West Point, when they graduate, they have an 8-year commitment, 5 years of active duty, and then 3 years in the reserves. And that's relevant for what we're about to hear. Mike Pence spoke to the graduating class a few days ago and effectively let slip that multiple wars are in play and that graduates of West Point should expect to be joining those wars. Paul Waldman caught this and wrote it up in the Washington Post. And I went back and looked at the transcript, and it's sickening. Take a listen to what Mike Pence said.
It's a virtual certainty that you will fight on a battlefield for America at some point in your life. You will lead soldiers in combat. It will happen. Some of you will join the fight against radical Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of you will join the fight on the Korean Peninsula and in the Indo-Pacific, where North Korea continues to threaten the peace and an increasingly militarized China challenges our presence in the region. Some of you will join the fight in Europe, where an aggressive Russia seeks to redraw international boundaries by force. And some of you may even be called upon to serve in this hemisphere. And when that day comes, I know you will move to the sound of the guns, do your duty, and you will fight.
It will happen. Afghanistan and Iraq. I thought we were out of Afghanistan and Iraq, other than exploring what our presence might be, never mind combat. The Korean Peninsula against North Korea or against a militarized China. What? We should be expecting that? We're going to fight in Europe, Mike Pence is talking about, fighting in Europe, this hemisphere, which to me means Latin America. My mind goes in the immediate to Venezuela, but there are other possibilities. And as Paul Waldman points out in the Washington Post piece, Pence is saying not just that more wars are inevitable in some general sense. He's talking about their inevitability during the time that these West Point graduates are going to be either in active or reserve duty. Now, the defenders will say, I know what they're going to come out and say, David, Pence isn't being specific. Pence isn't predicting. He's simply saying these are commissioned officers who lead troops. They are statistically likely to see combat. Well, that's not true. It has not been statistically likely that West Point grads see combat. And Pence is not speaking in generalities. He's talking about combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, 2 places we're supposedly leaving and to a degree have left. And the debate really has been about should or shouldn't the U.S. have a presence there and what should it look like and for how long. Mike Pence is talking about combat, leading troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. This should be front page news. Pence is talking about the Korean Peninsula and China. Remember that Trump said, we'll talk about North Korea again today, by the way. Trump said, we won't need combat with North Korea because Kim Jong-un is such a good guy and so trustworthy, and his sense of humor and his intelligence and everything is just so lovely. And Trump trusts him despite the continued missile launches, which we will get to. And yet Pence is saying you should expect that inevitably some of you are going to end up in a combat zone in the Korean Peninsula maybe involving an increasingly militarized China, and then Europe. I mean, which we could do an entire show on. Pence talking about that as well. So 8 years. It's an 8-year commitment for these graduates after they finish up their 4 years at West Point. 5 years of active duty, 3 years in the reserves. And Mike Pence is saying it's very likely that in those 8 years, they will see combat in some combination of Iraq, Afghanistan, China, North Korea, Europe, and he says this hemisphere. I'm hearing Latin America. I'm hearing Venezuela. Maybe, I guess we could take a guess at where else we're thinking of. Cuba could be a possibility. I don't know. Pence is referring to this as if it is a foregone conclusion and a mere inevitability. It's a question of where will each of you end up rather than if. And this is part of the totally toxic and destructive. This is military industrial complex. This is neoconservative American foreign policy at its worst. It's all of these things that depend on and assume and are fueled by the tacit acceptance that it's just a matter of figuring out which wars we're going to get involved in or start, rather than actually evaluating whether we should be involved in these sorts of conflicts or engagements at all. Extremely disturbing, almost beyond words, and not reported widely, which is why I'm leading the show with it today. I have some really great video today of one of the most prominent bad faith actors that have surfaced as brown-nosing Donald Trump sycophants during the last 2 years. And I'm talking, of course, about Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. The Trump presidency has been sort of great for Lindsey Graham and also a complete and total embarrassment for him. So on the one hand, Trump has been great for Lindsey Graham because Lindsey Graham sucking up to Trump has gotten him tons of airtime. He's way more known today than he was before the Trump presidency. And in a sense, his sort of personal profile has risen drastically under Donald Trump. On the other hand, though, Lindsey Graham has been caught in hilarious contradiction after contradiction. And if you're paying attention, you realize that Graham is a completely farcical political tool with no concern whatsoever for the truth or for what's right. And I told you back in April, you might remember, that even though Lindsey Graham now says Trump can't be impeached for any cover-up actions, like, for example, obstruction, because there was no underlying crime, for example, conspiracy to collude with Russia or whatever. We found video of Lindsey Graham, despite that, from the Clinton era, where he was actually ranting on the Senate floor about how Bill Clinton can be impeached, even though there was no underlying crime. So more recently, I've told you that the Trump administration is ignoring endless subpoenas for documents and directing witnesses to ignore subpoenas. And Lindsey Graham thinks that that's fine as long as it's the Trump administration. But it turns out there's a Lindsey, just like there's a Trump tweet for anything, it seems that there's a Lindsey Graham video for anything. It turns out that back in the late 1990s, Graham also said that ignoring congressional subpoenas or directing others to do so is an impeachable offense for a president of the United States. Of course, when the president at the time happened to be Democratic President Bill Clinton. So Fox News' Chris Wallace tried to call out Lindsey Graham, and it's pretty interesting. He plays the video for Graham. Graham doesn't really know which way is up or what's going on. And what he comes up with is just saying, well, the difference is Republicans act in good faith and Democrats act in bad faith. That's basically what it comes down to. And this all has to do, if you haven't been following it, and I really didn't while I was on break, but I've caught myself up on it. This all has to do with Democrats trying to get more information about the Mueller report, redacted versions, unredacted versions, Barr, etc. And that sets up the following exchange on Fox News.
You call all of what's going on here in Washington a political circus, but you took a different view back when you were leading the impeachment effort against Bill Clinton back in the late 90s. At that time, right, you said that any president, and you talked specifically about Clinton and Richard Nixon, who defied Congress when it came to subpoenas, was in danger of impeachment. Here you are back then.
You're becoming the judge and jury. It is not your job to tell us what we need. It is your job to comply with the things we need to provide oversight over you.
Question, why is it an impeachable offense for Clinton or Nixon back then to ignore congressional subpoenas, but it's okay for President Trump to do now?
Well, there's two things here. The Mueller investigation was a special counsel appointed to find out if the president committed a crime, if he colluded with the Russians, if he obstructed justice. The president gave him 1.4 million documents to Mueller. Everybody around the president was allowed to testify. He never claimed executive privilege. He complied, no cover-up, worked with Mueller. Mueller's the final word on this for me. So if Clinton had stiff Ken Starr, that's different. What Nadler's doing is trying to destroy the president and his family. If I were the president, I'd fight back against this political revenge coming out of the House. Mueller was the man of the law. Mueller was an independent voice that we all trusted to be fair. I don't trust House Democrats to be fair. They're trying to redo the Mueller report. They're trying to make up other stuff. And at the end of the day, it will be political suicide for them to impeach. If I were the president, I would fight Nadler tooth and nail. I'm glad he cooperated with Mueller. That's the difference.
So Lindsey Graham's explanation is, when he was calling people out in the 90s, the Republican Party was a responsible, respectable, good faith actor. And most importantly, they could be trusted not to act in a politically biased way. They were just doing the right thing. But 2019 Democrats can't be trusted, right? They are the political ones. But Republicans impeaching Clinton in the 1990s weren't being political. I'm having a hard time imagining a more outrageous explanation. Like if you said, come up with a more ridiculous way to explain the contradiction, I don't know that I could do better than the absurdity of what Lindsey Graham actually said. But I want to try to zoom out a little bit and take like a bigger picture view here rather than focusing on the specifics of Lindsey Graham's blatant and obvious political posturing. None of these elected officials have your best interests in mind, meaning Democrats play political games and Republicans play political games. Democrats play politics with subpoenas and congressional testimony, and Republicans do the exact same thing. There were rampant politics around the Bill Clinton impeachment and the Ken Starr investigation, no matter what Lindsey Graham says. And yes, there are rampant politics today from Democrats around the Trump stuff. But don't mistake what I'm saying for me playing this both sides do it equally sort of thing. I'm not doing the phone neutrality BS that you might hear on some other shows. The pathetic, fence-sitting, milquetoast, everybody is doing the same stuff on both sides thing that adds nothing to the conversation. That's not what I mean. Both sides play politics with all of this. But when Republicans were doing it with Bill Clinton, it was about a lie related to oral sex. Okay? Democrats are now using the same, I admit, these are tired tactics. These are depressing political techniques. But Democrats are doing it to try to figure out this full scope of what criminality may have been undertaken by the president of the United States and people around him, to figure out the full scope of the kleptocratic disaster that is this administration that has been participating in deliberate self-enrichment and violations or moves away from the systems of checks and balances that we have. So yeah, both sides do this garbage. Congressional subpoenas are political tools. A lot of these things are political tools that we've been seeing for decades on this in this country. But you have to understand the pernicious role that bottom feeders like Lindsey Graham have in 2019 versus thinking back to the 90s and what Bill Clinton's impeachment was all about. Do not fall for this truly moronic explanation for Lindsey Graham. Now, unfortunately, Chris Wallace didn't really follow up about the absurdity of it, but at least we got the clip that we got. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So I'm going to have to start thanking 2 new members per show instead of 1, because by doing just 1 per show, we've fallen so far behind. This is a really good problem to have. So let me say thanks today to Alan Shohat, who is today's first new member of the day, and also to Stephen Stackpool, who is today's second new member of the day. And then in addition, let me thank today's longtime sustaining member of the day, Crispin Del Nero, who has been with us for almost 5 years. Alan, Stephen, and Crispin, really appreciate your support. Do the right thing. Support media that you believe is important. It's very inexpensive. It makes a big difference, and it takes under a minute at joinpakman.com. Look forward to welcoming you as the new member of the day someday soon. Donald Trump has now denied that a North Korean missile launch happened after also saying that he's okay with the missile launch, which now he says didn't happen, at least in the way that is being reported. And I've got to take a little time to set this up. When I tell you about the horrible and erratic geopolitical behavior of Donald Trump, I'm not telling it to you because it's funny. I'm not telling it to you to score political points. And frankly, there aren't really political points to be scored because everybody loses. I mean, much of the country gets that this presidency is a geopolitical foreign policy disaster. And those that don't get that at this point in time aren't going to be convinced if I do another story about the embarrassing, ignorant tweet that Donald Trump posted or yet another dumb thing that Donald Trump said. But hopefully I've given you some insight on the show about the importance of the geopolitical issues that are at stake, or at least some of them. And one of those issues is North Korea, sort of in the context of the Russia, China, U.S. superpower love triangle, or whatever you want to call it. And a couple of weeks ago, I explained it in a little bit of detail. I explained how the United States has really fallen off the world stage, fallen on the world stage, fallen off of it, you could say, whatever analogy or metaphor you want to use. In the 2 years that Trump has been president, this has happened in ways that are significantly more far-reaching than Donald Trump and his administration can fix, right? This is something that's going to take a long time to fix, if indeed it's going to be fixed. And we are in the middle, in all of this, of a sort of political realignment, in terms of geopolitics. Germany now, by all measures, is the leader of the free world. It's not a literal term. Don't get mad at me. Look up what the term means. It's a colloquial term. And Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, has sort of taken the reins from the United States president, who usually holds that non-official title, leader of the free world. And in the meantime, what's likely to be the big superpower fight of the next decade between the United States and China and Russia is really going Russia and China's way in just about every sense. The U.S. is playing right into Russia's hand with Trump slamming NATO and criticizing our Western European allies. Meanwhile, the U.S. relationship with China is deteriorating, in part because of this trade war that Donald Trump is waging and losing. And meanwhile, Russia and China are getting closer. They're making more industry deals and trade deals and energy development deals, and they're putting the United States aside increasingly. And in the middle of this, we come to North Korea, which we're talking about today, who historically has had only China as its primary pseudo-ally. It's not even really always been an ally of North Korea, China, but it's been an ally in some ways. Trump has held 2 summits with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. In both, Trump came away extremely impressed with Kim's sense of humor, his intelligence, his negotiation skills, but Trump got nothing out of it. Vague promises at the first summit, nothing happened. Second summit ended abruptly with no progress, but Trump just seemed smitten with Kim Jong-un. And it was reported over this past weekend that North Korea is launching missiles. Again, Japan, the United Nations Security Council, Trump's own national security advisor, John Bolton, all saying North Korea has fired ballistic missiles that violate the United Nations Security Council resolutions. Trump first tweeted he's okay with the launch, and then later denied that the launch took place, at least as described. If it happened, it's fine, but I don't think that it actually happened, even though everybody around me is telling me that it happened. Trump tweeting first, quote, North Korea fired off some small weapons, which disturbed some of my people and others, but not me. I have confidence that Chairman Kim will keep his promise to me. By the way, chairman, what exactly is he chairman of? And also smiled when he called swamp man Joe Biden a low IQ individual and worse. Perhaps that's sending me a signal. An extremely unhinged tweet. And instead of taking the side of our ally, Japan, of his own intelligence, his own national security advisor, John Bolton, Trump taking the side of Chairman Kim and using it as an opportunity to sort of join with Kim Jong-un in criticizing Joe Biden. So here the position, at least initially, is the missile launch happened, but Trump says, well, it was small weapons and it's okay. But then Trump in Japan at a joint press conference with Shinzo Abe, Trump just says, oh yeah, everybody else is wrong. The launch that I said is fine really didn't happen. Trump saying, quote, my people think it could have been a violation. I view it differently. I view it as a man. Perhaps he wants to get attention and perhaps not. Who knows? It doesn't matter. All I know is that there have been no nuclear tests. There have been no ballistic missiles going out. There have been no long-range missiles going out. He knows that with nuclear, that's never going to happen. Only bad can happen. He understands. He is a very smart man. He gets it. Understand that there's the continued ignorance by Trump when it comes to North Korea, but now it's also wrapped up with an insult to Japan. While in Japan, Trump is saying that he believes apparently his own opinion over what Japan believes and over our own intelligence and over the United Nations and over our own national security advisor. And then it becomes an issue not just of Trump's geopolitical skill, which is close to zero, as you can probably tell, but this becomes an issue about Donald Trump's judgment, which aside from politics and aside from Trump's position on abortion, for example, aside from Trump's positions on issues, when you have a president that so significantly lacks in judgment, it's dangerous. And that's what I want to talk about next. So I already told you about Donald Trump with another example of his just terrible judgment, initially saying that he's fine with the North Korean missile launch that later he says didn't actually happen. This is a serious concern, or at least it should be, for the movement that cares about rationality and critical thinking and modern geopolitical relationships and really everything else under the umbrella of what I like to call reality. If you care about reality, if you want to operate in a world where reality influences our views and decisions and our sort of place in the world as humans, then you have to recognize that the fact that there's something very wrong with Donald Trump's judgment is an existential risk to the United States. And when we look back at all of these examples of Trump's poor judgment, I mean, just to give you a few, Trump's repeated statements that he believed Russian President Vladimir Putin, that Russia didn't interfere in the 2016 US election. That was Trump using what he believes to be his good judgment, which is not, to read a guy like Vladimir Putin and to come away saying, I believe him. I trust him. I think he's telling me the truth. Of course, we now have endless dozens and dozens of assessments and the Mueller report and everything else, which tells us actually American intelligence conclusions were right from the beginning about Russian interference. That one we talked about a lot. We just talked about the North Korea example 5 minutes ago. Trump said he doesn't think that Kim Jong-un and the regime did anything in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions with their recent launch. You'll remember that Donald Trump also said he doesn't believe that anybody high up at in North Korea, had anything to do with or even awareness of what happened with the death of Otto Warmbier. Remember when Donald Trump said this?
I know the Warmbier family very well. I think they're an incredible family. What happened is horrible. I really believe something very bad happened to him, and I don't think that the top leadership knew about it. And when they had to send him home, by the way, I got the prisoners back, I got the hostages back, and Otto was one of the hostages, but Otto came back in shape that was not even to be talked about. I thought it was horrible. Now, the others came back extremely healthy, but Otto came back in a condition that was just terrible. And I did speak about it, and I don't believe that he would have allowed that to happen. It just wasn't to his advantage to allow that to happen.
Kim Jong-un, or at least the top leadership, knows when there are Americans being held in North Korea. Their value is huge to the North Korean propaganda machine, and it is an absolutely absurd assertion that Donald Trump made, and another example of his poor judgment. There's lots of other examples where it's more a question of, is Trump's judgment bad or is he just dumb? Like when he said Mexico is going to pay for the wall. Any sensible person realized they were never going to pay for it. It just wasn't going to happen. And Donald Trump insisted that they were. Is that bad judgment? Is that being dumb? Is that deliberately lying? I'm not really sure. Trump had the bad judgment to choose Michael Flynn as his national security advisor, despite having been warned multiple times by multiple people, including Barack Obama, about Michael Flynn. We know how that ended with Michael Flynn indicted. Trump had the bad judgment to attack John McCain endlessly, even after John McCain died. The disastrous judgment, which led Trump to start this endless, unwinnable trade war with China, which allows Russia to swoop in and improve their relationship with China, increasingly leaving the United States out to pasture. The limitless bad judgment of violating the Iran deal, even though Iran didn't violate the deal, which, as I told you 2 weeks ago, is now leading Iran to resume researching nuclear technology, predictable, and an internally logical move from Iran's point of view. And the more I think about it, I actually don't know whether these are examples of bad judgment or of Trump being simply ignorant or of Donald Trump being a bad person. But in either case, it's the motherload of bad decisions and bad positions that are coming from Donald Trump's inability or unwillingness to actually judge situations for what they are. We're sort of in a 1984-esque era in that way. I know that in the last couple of years, I've said that a lot of elements of what's going on today are less like 1984 and more like Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This particular thing is more a 1984 thing, right? War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Everything's backwards. Nothing is as it seems. And Donald Trump even said that, trying to remember something like, what you are seeing and hearing, you shouldn't believe, or you can't believe what you are seeing and hearing. It's good to be back from my vacation and my trip, because we've got to get down to business with removing this menace, because it is becoming extraordinarily belligerent and significantly more urgent, particularly as these long-term relationships are broken and bad decisions are made. And it's going to take whoever replaces Trump, be it in 2 years, I guess more like a year and a half now, whether it's in a year and a half or in 5.5 years, whoever ultimately replaces Donald Trump is going to have years of work to do to fix the problems that Donald Trump has created. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram to vote in this week's poll at David Pakman Show. We'll take a quick break and be back with much, much more right after this. It's great to be back.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Anna Merlan, who is a senior reporter at Geo Media Group and author of the new book, Republic of Lies. Anna, so great to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.
So we spoke, I guess now it was a couple of weeks ago, with Nancy Rosenblum from Harvard University about the rise in conspiracism, sort of separate from specific conspiracy theories, in a sense, the sort of underlying societal issues that come with that, et cetera. I want to talk with you a little bit about the way in which the theories themselves have kind of evolved over time, and then maybe we can dig into the impact of that. I mean, give us a general sense, like, where did conspiracy theories start? How have they changed in the last 100 years, in the last 5 years?
Mm-hmm. Well, conspiracy theories have always been a part of society, and they've especially always been a part of American society from the outset. What we know is that up until World War II, most ordinary people's conspiracy theories were about outside groups, what they perceived as outside groups, whether that was communists, Masons, Jews, some kind of paranoia about these outside groups seizing control. And then after World War I, as the federal government got bigger, most ordinary people's conspiracy theories started to center around the government itself and who was really in charge and what the government was really doing. I would say that in the last 5 years, the main change that we've seen is the number of people who are trying to make money off of some type of conspiracism, what I and other people refer to as conspiracy entrepreneurs, people who see some kind of avenue for fame or success through spreading what some folks would consider to be conspiratorial ideas.
Are there, that's super interesting actually, are there particular types or specific conspiracy theories that are particularly profitable? And if so, why?
I wouldn't say so, no. I mean, what we know is that most people tend to feel more comfortable with conspiracy theories that line up with where they are politically and socially already. So, conspiracy theories garner support from people on the right if they are right-leaning, the same with on the left. What I do see, however, is that most people can't make money as conspiracy entrepreneurs solely from just going on YouTube or having a Periscope. The really successful ones are people like Alex Jones, who also sell a product. Alex Jones, I think most people know by now, most of the money that he makes is from sales of supplements and other products that are sort of nominally health oriented.
Yeah, there are, a lot of conspiracy theories have nothing to do with religion per se, but it's interesting that one of the ways that some of these religious media outlets are also monetizing is by using sort of, I don't know whether the conspiracy theory is the right term, but sort of apocalyptic fears and rapture sort of imagery and that type of thing, also to be selling a product. And it seems that that is a sort of integral part of the entrepreneurship component.
Yeah, it's very common, and you'll see a lot of overlap among those groups. There is a big sort of apocalyptic, especially Christian element in a lot of American right-wing conspiracy culture. But I mean, fundamentally, one of the core aspects of conspiracism is this idea that some massive, consequential, damaging change is right around the corner, and that if action is not taken right now, something terrible will happen, which is, of course, a really profitable way to sell all kinds of things, is by creating this sense of urgency and fear and panic.
Can you give an example of, I don't know that I necessarily want to brand all conspiracy theories as either sort of real world dangerous or real world harmless. It seems that there's probably some kind of spectrum, but at least to kind of get into that discussion, can you give an example of a prevalent conspiracy theory that does not seem to connect to sort of like real world danger, either for the believers in it or for others, bystanders, as we might call them? And then on the other side, one that does have significant real world consequences?
Like you say, it's really, really hard to classify things that way because a lot of people have sort of overlapping conspiratorial beliefs. A lot of times people will enter through one subculture and end up elsewhere, and it's really hard to tell who is going to take real world damaging actions. I mean, for instance, flat Earth is a subculture that is very small, but it is growing. We know there are more flat earthers than there were a few years ago. And on its surface, that one is pretty silly, but it is harmless, more or less. It's a little bit alarming, but it is harmless. However, I and other people who cover this have noted that there is a lot of Holocaust denial in those worlds, that something about flat eartherism tends to lead to a kind of question everything mentality that goes into some really weird and potentially dark places. And of course, once you get into Holocaust denial, you're more susceptible to white nationalist ideas, right? So it can be really hard to say. But yeah, on its face, flat Earth is probably not a huge cause for concern. I would say things like Pizzagate and QAnon, on the other hand, have been mostly harmless, but obviously there have been some pretty sizable exceptions to that, mainly Edgar Welch, who went to Comet Ping Pong in DC, the supposed site of this Democrat-run child sex slave ring, with a gun, intent on saving children. And so I would say that the subcultures that make me the most nervous are obviously the ones that are tied with white nationalism and extremism, as well as the ones that brand their enemies as child abusers. Because when you are talking about child abuse, when you're accusing someone of being a pedophile or someone who hurts children, it justifies any kind of action against them. There's almost nothing that isn't justified to stop that kind of behavior. And so it sets up this very apocalyptic, potentially violent rhetoric that does make me a little bit nervous.
Here's what I don't understand about the sort of transfer from one conspiracy theory to belief in another. So you mentioned the idea of you get in through flat Earth and then all of a sudden you end up with like Holocaust denial. Why do we not seem to see, and if it exists, I would love to hear about it. You don't see people who, for example, enter via flat Earth and then come to the realization that huge corporations that benefit from cheap immigrant labor, love the idea that there is this sort of argument or debate between low and middle income people and immigrants over who is actually responsible for keeping wages low and stealing jobs. That's a real thing where we have these huge corporations benefiting by sort of fomenting that battle.
Right.
But you don't really see the traditional conspiracy theorists ever end up with that one, which happens to be true. They end up with something more cartoonish like Holocaust denial. Why is that the path and not the one that I mentioned?
I mean, it could be that some individual conspiracy consumers do come to more or less the place that you're talking about. People who, for instance, entered through something like 9/11 trutherism from the documentary Loose Change, which was pretty influential for a bunch of people in that world. Not all of those people became hardcore 9/11 truthers. Some of them came to believe that there was, as you say, just a political and social reason why those conspiracy theories spread. I think really I would say that we don't see people sort of loudly and publicly leaving conspiracy communities for a more reality-based version of the world because the algorithms that spread conspiracy theories don't really reward those kinds of claims or proclamations. Somebody who is a really, really big conspiracy YouTuber just sort of doesn't have any particular motivation to come out and say that they were wrong, and they've actually come to a different and more grounded view of the world.
Can you quantify in any way the effect that the Trump presidency has had on belief in conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking?
So we know that conspiracy theories wax and wane in America, depending on sort of times of social upheaval, times of social upheavals, social unrest, when we're questioning who we are as people. We tend to see a rise in conspiracism, and typically whatever political party is out of power is more prone to conspiracy theorizing. So we see a little bit more of it on the left than we did during the Obama years. What is really unique about the Trump presidency, of course, is that he himself uses conspiracy theories and spreads them, and seems to see them as a way to solidify his base, solidify support for him, and to try to identify a common enemy to encourage his supporters to be mad at, instead of him, a scapegoat, which is something that we see a lot in more authoritarian countries. It's unusual, but not unheard of for a U.S. president. And it really sort of raises the stakes of what conspiracy theories mean. If Trump wakes up tomorrow and decides to start tweeting that vaccines cause autism, or, that Q of
which
QAnon
he's previously
is real,
done, by the way.
Which he's previously done. Yes, he previously did that before he was president and has not talked about it too much since he's become president, which is a very good thing. But yeah, if he wakes up and decides to start promoting a more virulent conspiracy theory from the Oval Office, that will have huge effects, obviously.
You mentioned that it's unusual, but not without precedent to see a president pushing stuff like this. What are other examples of presidents?
I mean, Nixon is obviously the most obvious example of a conspiracy theorist president. He was someone who believed, that there was a communist plot against him that was actually orchestrated by Jews. When Andrew Jackson, someone tried to assassinate Andrew Jackson, and he came to believe that it was functionally the deep state, functionally that there was some kind of plot within government to assassinate him instead of a lone gunman. So we see it like here and there throughout American history. Something that is really sort of unusual about Trump is that we can see it in real time, and we can see it via social media, how he's attempting to sort of use these theories for his own gain.
Yeah, that's been a definite change in terms of the environment around the president, for sure. Absolutely fascinating stuff. We've been speaking with Anna Merlan, who is a senior reporter at Geo Media Group, also author of the new book, Republic of Lies, which I highly encourage you to check out. Anna, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There is an effort being made by the current administration and by the people surrounding it to redefine what treason is, and it's genuinely menacing. When we see these authoritarian slides, we have to understand that they're often slow slides. It's the slow erosion of what it means to have a truly free and independent press, for example. And it gets chipped away at a little bit at a time by the idea of suing media outlets, journalism licenses, stricter White House press pass policies, the smears about fake news. It's a long list, but they're really slow attempts, less and less frequent press briefings by the White House press secretary. It's a slow process that you have to observe from afar rather than day to day. Another example, the slow erosion of the independence of our branches of government and the systems of checks and balances, including the investigative power of the House and Senate, ignoring subpoenas, getting your own attorney general in there to manage the results of an investigation into you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to realize that these things happen slowly, and it can be, I don't even know if this is an actual thing, but you often hear about the frog that goes into a cold pan. You start heating up the pan, heats up slowly, the frog doesn't realize it's being burned. That may not even work. Maybe the frog just jumps out when it gets hot, but that's the metaphor that I think many of us are familiar with. And there is now a slow but very sure and creeping slide to redefine treason by the administration. Yesterday, Donald Trump published or retweeted an article that quotes Liz Cheney, the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, as saying that statements made by agents investigating Donald Trump could be treason. And in the linked interview, Liz Cheney even says that FBI agents who investigated Trump could have been attempting a coup. These are attempts at redefinition. If you control the language, you control everything. I forget where that quote is from. They are trying to control the language. Treason. Treason is the crime of betraying one's country, especially by attempting to kill the sovereign or overthrow the government. That is not what the investigations into Donald Trump sought to do. They certainly weren't attempting to kill the sovereign, and they were not attempting to overthrow the government. They were investigating whether Donald Trump specifically committed crimes. A coup is a sudden, violent, and illegal seizure of power from a government. Of course, those investigating Donald Trump didn't attempt to do that. And if Donald Trump were to leave, there would be no seizure of power from a government. It would likely be Mike Pence takes over, although there are other scenarios as well. So what you have to understand is that they are systematically trying to change the meaning of these things in order to favor their position on whatever, in this case, these investigations. And in fact, Donald Trump was asked about his treason claim recently, a few days ago. And look at what happened. And in further fact, I should mention, as far as Liz Cheney is concerned, Liz Cheney, if she wants to talk about treason, the closest thing to treason she might be well positioned to comment on would be the war crimes that her dad, Dick Cheney, participated in within the Bush administration. And even then, it is dubious whether you could actually make a treason case there, as many legal experts have said. So here's Donald Trump asked about treason's punishable by death. Who exactly are you talking about?
The Constitution says treason is punishable by death. You've accused your adversaries of treason. Who specifically are you accusing of treason?
Well, I think a number of people, and I think what you look is that they have unsuccessfully tried to take down the wrong person. If you look at Comey, if you look at McCabe, if you look at probably people higher than that, if you look at Strzok, if you look at his lover, Lisa Page, his wonderful lover, the two lovers, they talked openly. You know, they didn't use their private server because they didn't want to get caught, so they used the government server. That was not a good move. He talked about the insurance policy just in case crooked Hillary loses, and that didn't work out too well for them. So you look at them, they want an insurance policy so that should she, for any reason, lose, remember, 100 million to 1. Maybe he said 100 million to nothing. But should she lose, we'll have an insurance policy and we'll get this guy out of office. And that's what they said, and that's what they meant. That's treason. That's treason. They couldn't win the election, and that's what happened. And that's what's happening right now, because without the treason word, I guess, but that's what's happening now.
James Comey, John McCain, Peter Strzok, who was working for Mueller and was dismissed when politically biased private text messages went public. As far as Democrats not thinking they can win without trying to remove Trump forcibly or whatever, it's the opposite. It's been Trump who has been saying Democrats can't win fair and square in 2020 which is how Trump has been hinting at the possibility of not accepting the results of the election if he loses. This is complete and total projection. And there's a real question here. I don't know the answer to this. If a president publicly accuses you of treason by name, is there any recourse? Is that defamation? The act of damaging the good reputation of someone, slander or libel? When the president says that specific individuals have committed a crime, but not just any crime, the crime of treason, is there any recourse that those individuals have? And is that really where we are right now? We've got to take control back. There's no other way around it. This is becoming extremely dangerous. And these redefinitions should be concerning to everybody who's been paying attention to what's going on. And this is not happening by accident. This is a concerted effort to start throwing around the word treason, particularly at a time when what we are learning is that there was wrongdoing by Trump and everybody around him. It's an attempt to distract from that and instead say the investigators are the individuals who were treasonous. We can't fall for it, and we've got to act sooner than later, November of 2020, in order to stop this insanity. Speaking of voting in November, by the way, Texas has had an acting Secretary of State, and this man named David Whitley, of course a Republican, has now resigned after wrongly questioning the citizenship of almost 100,000 people. And even more hilarious is that in his resignation letter, he didn't even mention the botched voter purge that took place in Texas at all. The resignation letter is a blatant whitewashing of what actually happened. The voter purge was actually ended back in April, and there was a settlement that was reached with civil rights groups who sued over it. And what's even more insane about all of this is that under the terms of the agreement that was reached over this voter purge, the next Secretary of State, whoever it ends up being, can keep trying to identify non-citizens and remove them from the voter rolls as long as they put in place some better screening methods so that they get more accurate results. Now, that piece actually makes sense. I mean, if you zoom out, states should be allowed to remove non-citizens from voter rolls. That's perfectly reasonable. The problem is that in practice, it's been made crystal clear that it's a tactic motivated by voter suppression to help Republicans, period. The way it went down is that they claim to have found 95,000 non-citizens registered to vote. They started sending these lists out to the individual county officials to start pulling those people off of the voter rolls. And then very quickly they admitted, and a court agreed, oh yeah, that list was bogus. It wasn't actually made up of non-citizens registered to vote. But of course, by then it was too late to stop the propaganda war effect. Donald Trump was tweeting about it saying, look, rampant voter fraud. Here's an example from Texas. And Trump actually claimed that of those 95,000 non-citizens who were supposedly identified by Texas, 58,000 voted. And of course, everything was a lie. A federal judge ruled that way, saying there wasn't widespread voter fraud. And this Whitley guy's strategy was a complete and total mess. So here are the key takeaways. Number one, this is all part of the untrue story that Trump's been telling us since November of 2016, and Republicans have been telling us for even longer than that millions of people are voting illegally. With Trump specifically, it was 3 to 5 million people voted illegally. Hillary Clinton didn't really win the popular vote. It was because of those 3 to 5 million illegal votes. This is so laughably false at this point that I don't even want to spend that much time on it. The more important thing to understand here is that we can't let the right play games with this to make it seem as though we on the left want people to vote illegally, okay? Because every time we call out the horrible implementation of these strategies that the right does deliberately to disenfranchise likely Democratic voters, or those more likely to be Democratic voters, they will say, hold on, lefties, are you saying you want people voting illegally? You're saying you don't want to remove people who aren't citizens from voter rolls? See, you're part of the problem. So we've got to be prepared to take that head on. And the answer is, the position is obvious. Of course, we want only legal voters voting. And overwhelmingly, that's what happens. Every major study has found that fraudulent votes are almost non-existent. They are statistically insignificant when it comes to the results of actual elections. The reason that we are correct to be suspicious and disgusted with Republicans doing this stuff is not because we want illegal votes. It's because it's not a problem. And the right has admitted behind closed doors, and we even have video of them admitting it in public in some cases, they are doing all of this to hurt the left. Higher turnout helps the left. More voting helps the left. Voting access helps the left. So don't allow them to change the narrative. We're against illegal voters. They barely exist, though, and the real issue is voter suppression. It's not voter fraud, and this has been at this point, I don't know, could we say it's a multi-decade effort to suppress votes in a way that is strategically advantageous to Republicans? Don't let them play the games. Good that this guy Whitley has resigned. Bad that he was able to whitewash the resignation with this bogus resignation letter. And now we've got to see who it is that the Governor Abbott is going to nominate. Probably won't be until after the 2020 election. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Take a listen to this voicemail that came in about social democracy and technological unemployment.
Hey, David. My name is Justin. I'm from Washington State. My question is, as a social democrat, should we be opposed to automation taking service jobs away from working class people? Thank you.
Okay, so this is a really good question. Whether you're a social democrat or not, the right answer here is a simple one. Historical efforts to oppose technology on the basis that it would destroy jobs have failed, period. We could probably find some examples where there has been a successful effort to suppress a technology, at least temporarily, on the basis that it would destroy jobs. But historically saying we need to suppress this coming technology because people will lose their jobs has not worked. What we need to take seriously is rethinking the relationship of humans to work. For example, technological automation, if you imagine a business with 100 employees, technological automation could make 50 of those employees unnecessary. And one way that the business could respond would be to say, we're replacing 50 employees with machines, we're keeping 50 employees, 50 people lose their jobs. It doesn't have to go that way. The other way that it could be done is the business says, well, what we're going to do is keep all of our 100 employees, but they'll each work only 2.5 days a week or 4 hours a day instead of 8 or whatever else. Now, obviously, the business is not going to be willing to use the entire gain from the technology and give it all to the workers. But maybe they say, we'll keep our 100 employees and they can work 6 or 5 hours a day instead of 8. And we will sort of split the gains from the technology. Now, obviously, there needs to be some reason that the business would choose to do that. And there are people, including Bill Gates, who have started floating ideas and sort of thinking about different ways in which we might be able to make that happen. But no, I think that it's not only misguided. I think most importantly, it's a futile effort to try to oppose the technology on the basis that jobs will be lost. We need to rethink how the gains from these technologies should be distributed. And that's where 90% of the issue is. Okay, I will tell a bunch of vacation stories on the bonus show today, including 2 dog poop stories. I don't know that we've ever really had dog poop stories on the show. And I regularly visit Argentina, so it makes it all the more incredible that there haven't been dog poop stories on the show. Anybody who's walked around Buenos Aires will understand what I mean. But I do have 2 dog poop stories today and a whole bunch of other stuff. Become a member or a patron to get instant access to the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.